You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. In the summer of 2021, a 71-year-old retired doctor stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He barely recognized himself. Since returning from a river rafting trip 2 weeks ago, he had lost 15 pounds, almost a pound every day. He looked 10 years older than he had just a few weeks ago, and he felt 10 years older. He picked up his toothbrush and squeezed some paste onto the bristles. Just then, intense fatigue washed over his entire body. Then he had an overwhelming urge to vomit. Moments later, he was lying on the cold bathroom tiles, coughing and gagging as severe pain shot through his stomach like a knife. Until now, this retired doctor had tried to be his own doctor, taking endless notes about his symptoms and his condition and how it was going, but now he realized that he was not up to the task of figuring out what was wrong with him. Then he blacked out. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we'll explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please add a scoop of dirt to the follow button's can of coffee grounds. Going into the wilderness can be good for your body and soul. But sometimes, things can get a bit rough out there. Maybe you sprain an ankle, or maybe you get sick from drinking unfiltered water. And then there are other times that something truly awful can happen to you out there. Something that you never see coming. On this episode, we have 2 stories about people who come back from outdoor adventures with life-threatening conditions. Our first story is about a retired doctor who returns from a rafting trip with debilitating pain in his abdomen. Then the second story is about a woman who ends up fighting for her life after going camping in Vermont. Here is our first story called Gut Instinct. In early July of 2021, 71-year-old Thomas Trizona dragged a large inflatable raft across a sandy beach on the Colorado River. It was just before sunset, and he was sweaty and tired, but happy. It was the last day of a 2-week whitewater rafting trip in the Grand Canyon, and even though he desperately needed a hot shower, Thomas felt invigorated and youthful. Thomas was a retired surgical oncologist, which means he was a doctor who operated on people with cancer. He loved being a doctor and had always been a total workaholic. But after retiring earlier this year, he finally had time for himself. And one of the first things he had done was take this adventurous vacation with his wife, Amy. Whitewater rafting had been as thrilling as he had hoped it would be. They'd floated past Native American ruins and through canyons with cliff walls stretching nearly a mile over their heads. They had seen eagles, condors, and bighorn sheep. Now, on the last night of the trip, Thomas and Amy secured the raft and joined the rest of their tour group around the campfire. Thomas's stomach growled as he watched their guide grill another delicious meal for them. Thomas looked forward to dinner and then one more night of stories around the fire. Tomorrow, it would be time to return home to Springfield, Oregon. But for now, Thomas just gazed up at the setting sun, knowing he'd cherish these memories forever. On July 16th, so a few days after returning home to Oregon, Thomas sat at his dining room table feeling bloated and nauseous. His wife, Amy, had prepared a beautiful dinner, but Thomas only pushed the food around on his plate. He told Amy that his upper abdomen really hurt. He'd started to feel sick shortly after getting home from their rafting trip, and he was now starting to lose weight. And this morning, it seemed like the pain had gotten even worse. It was now coming on in these big waves. Amy suggested that maybe he ate or drank something weird on their trip. Maybe he contracted a parasite. Thomas said he only drank the filtered water, and he didn't have diarrhea, which was a common symptom of parasite infections. And anyways, if he had picked up something on the trip, then Amy would probably have it too. But when he looked at Amy and asked her how she was feeling, she just kind of shook her head and said she didn't feel sick at all. Thomas knew that his wife was probably right, and his pains were no big deal. But as a retired doctor, Thomas couldn't resist diagnosing himself. Just in case it did turn out to be something serious that required him to see his physician, Thomas began keeping a detailed journal to record all of his symptoms. He thought that this journal would help him understand what was causing his pain. Thomas had seen some heart-wrenching cases in his long career as a cancer surgeon, and as he tracked his symptoms over the next few days, he started to get nervous. He wanted to stay open-minded about what was causing his symptoms, but he couldn't help gravitating toward the dreaded disease he knew so well: cancer. Thomas reminded Amy that his mother had died of pancreatic cancer when she was only 74. In his experience, a previously healthy 71-year-old man with persistent abdominal pain and unexplained weight loss could only mean one thing. Until he was proven wrong, Thomas was certain he had cancer too. Thomas picked up his cell phone and called his close friend, Jonathan Gonen. Dr. Gonen was a gastroenterologist, a doctor who specialized in the stomach and intestinal tract. Thomas told his friend that he wanted a CT scan to figure out if he had a tumor in his abdomen. But unfortunately, the earliest appointment Dr. Gonen could get for Thomas was a few weeks away in August. Thomas hung up the phone feeling disappointed. There was nothing he could do except wait. A week later, Thomas stood in front of the bathroom mirror squeezing toothpaste onto his brush. And then he looked up and felt totally alarmed by his reflection. He was pale and gaunt, his weight was now down about 15 pounds since he'd returned from that rafting trip, and now he could barely stand from the fatigue he felt, let alone brush his teeth. Just then, a bout of nausea swept over Thomas, and he rushed to the toilet. He dropped to his knees preparing to vomit, but nothing came out. All of a sudden, he felt these severe spasms in his stomach as he fell over sideways onto the floor. The tiles were freezing cold against his cheek as he lay there shivering in just his boxers. Then he called out to his wife and said he needed to go to the emergency room right now. Later that afternoon, Thomas sat next to Amy in the emergency room's crowded waiting room. His blood had been drawn by a nurse, and he was waiting for the results. Thomas's phone pinged. He grabbed it and opened a message to find the results of his blood tests. All were normal except for one. He had elevated levels of a type of white blood cell called eosinophils. That, Thomas knew, could indicate three things: an allergy, a parasitic infection, or cancer. Thomas had already decided that he didn't have a parasitic infection, and he didn't think he had an allergy either. So that left only one possibility, the one he most suspected: cancer. Thomas asked the nurse at the reception area if he could speak directly with the doctor about the results. She told him that they had a long list of patients that day with serious problems that required immediate attention. Thomas could wait if he wanted, but it would likely be 4 or 5 hours until a doctor could see him. Thomas considered his options. He was pretty sure he did have cancer, but he knew he likely was not in any sort of immediate danger because of the cancer. And no matter what a doctor would say to him that day if he waited around to speak to one, it would still take way more testing to determine if he really had cancer or not. So Thomas stood up and told Amy they would just leave. He would deal with his cancer tomorrow. The next day, Thomas sat across the desk from his primary care physician. The doctor looked at the results on his computer as Thomas tried to describe his symptoms. And then at some point, the doctor asked Thomas about his diet and routines. And then after hearing what Thomas had to say, the doctor glanced up from the screen and told Thomas that, you know what, this is probably a dietary issue. And then he suggested Thomas try a grain-free diet. Thomas was stunned. He wanted to be screened for cancer. And now his primary physician was telling Thomas, a cancer specialist, to just try a grain-free diet? It seemed kind of asinine. And so Thomas just stood up and curtly thanked the doctor, and then took back the test results and left the building. 4 days later, Thomas was sitting at his dining room table with his laptop open in front of him when he got the best news he had received in a very long time. The results of the CT scan he'd finally been allowed to take had just come back. And the results were normal. He did not have cancer. Thomas felt an enormous wave of relief, But now he was more puzzled than ever. The pain in his abdomen had not gone away. He had barely eaten in the past 4 days, and he had now lost 22 pounds since he had returned from that rafting trip. And so Thomas was back to trying to figure out what was going on with him himself. And so while sitting at the dining room table, he began scanning through his journal with all of his symptoms he had recorded, while also going on his computer and looking up possible obscure disorders that might fit his symptoms. And as he clicked through these medical sites, he turned his attention to a chronic digestive disease in which white blood cells build up inside of the intestines, causing pain and bowel obstruction. Thomas knew that the condition, called eosinophilic gastroenteritis, was rare, but he was running out of ideas. He was growing desperate to know what was going on with him. He was in agony, both physically and mentally. And even though he was a doctor, he was completely stumped, and this made him feel so helpless. So eventually, Thomas just picked up his phone and called his friend, Dr. Gonen, to see if maybe he could help him again. A week later, Dr. Gonen paced inside of his office. He had just arranged to have Thomas have a tiny camera inserted down into his throat to look around inside of him to see if maybe he had a bowel obstruction. But like all of the other tests Thomas had undergone, this one too came back with normal results. Dr. Gonen was bewildered by his friend's case. He decided to order one more test to get a better look at Thomas's small intestine. The images on this specialized MRI would be much sharper than the CT scan, which would allow doctors to see very small problem spots. Dr. Gonen hoped the added clarity and details of the imaging would finally reveal what was wrong with his friend. The day after the MRI, Thomas went to the radiologist's office to discuss the results. Looking over the images, Thomas was surprised to see a tiny abnormality in his upper left abdomen. This abnormality was about 1 inch long and very, very thin. The radiologist told Thomas that the shiny spot looked more fuzzy on the earlier CT scan, and he thought it was just a buildup of plaque on Thomas's artery wall, which is a common sign of aging. But with the specialized MRI, it made it clear to the radiologist that he'd been wrong. Something strange was going on inside of Thomas's stomach. Then the radiologist had an idea. He was curious to see if this weird spot was stationary or moving around inside of Thomas, and so he offered to do another CT scan right then to find out. Thomas agreed, and they performed the scan immediately. And sure enough, it showed that the weird spot had moved in just a few weeks between one CT scan and the next. But before the two men could decide what to do about this weird moving skinny spot inside of Thomas's stomach, the radiologist noticed something else that required immediate attention. It might explain Thomas's chronic pain too. Thomas leaned in and saw on the image that there was another small spot. The doctor told Thomas that it was a gallstone, a hard mass that was growing in his gallbladder. Thomas and the radiologist stared at each other. Gallstones can cause severe pain and cause serious problems if left untreated. And so Thomas's inflamed gallbladder needed to be removed immediately. On September 13th, Thomas underwent surgery to remove his gallbladder. In the last moments before the anesthesia knocked him out, Thomas prayed that he was about to be rid of the terrible stomach pains he had endured for 2 months. A few hours after the operation was over, Thomas lay in a hospital bed resting with Amy by his side. His surgeon entered the room, walked to Thomas's bedside, and stood there grinning. The surgeon said that he had successfully removed the gallstone and the inflamed gallbladder, but that was actually not what was making Thomas sick after all. The surgeon explained that while he had Thomas's abdomen open, he decided to investigate that tiny, thin spot, the trouble spot, from the MRI scans. And he found something he had never seen before in his entire career, something that totally explained all of Thomas's symptoms: his severe stomach pain, his nausea, his weight loss, and his constant fatigue. The surgeon pulled a small vial from his pocket and held it up for Thomas to see. It contained a small object about the size and shape of a needle. Thomas asked what it was, and the surgeon said he wasn't sure, but it was very sharp and it was inside of Thomas's intestines. And so no wonder he was in so much pain. From the looks of it, It was almost like Thomas had unintentionally swallowed a needle. Thomas leaned back in his bed, staring at this little thing inside of the vial. He couldn't believe that such a small object had caused so much misery. But he was obviously very relieved that the ordeal was now over. However, he knew he would not be able to rest easy until he figured out what this thing was that he swallowed and how he actually swallowed it. A few days later, Thomas took the object in the vial to a lab for analysis. The analyst found that it was a thin metal wire just under 1 inch long. What's more, they found a carbon pattern on the metal that exactly matched burned barbecue sauce. Thomas thought back to that last night on the Colorado River during the rafting trip and the delicious meal his guide had grilled for the whole group around the fire. That was the last grilled meat he had eaten before he started getting sick. Now everything was clear. The black metal object found in Thomas's intestine was likely a metal bristle from the brush his guide had used to clean the grates of the grill on that magical final evening of their trip. Thomas chuckled. He always knew that he would keep his memory of the Colorado trip for the rest of his life, but he didn't realize that he had also swallowed a little souvenir that would force him to remember. Here is our second story called Into the Woods. On a Saturday morning in June of 2009, a 55-year-old woman named Elizabeth and her husband Ron pulled their RV into a campsite in western Vermont. Elizabeth loved camping and took every chance she could to head for the wild, leaving behind her comfortable suburban life in Connecticut. But as she had gotten older, she had begun to enjoy the comfort of an RV. It was much nicer to sleep in a warm bed at night and not have to deal with the hassle of setting up a tent and then sleeping on the ground. The RV lifestyle was just so simple and so easy. Today, all the couple had to do was park their RV at the campsite, then put on some sunscreen, and then head out for their hike. And so, that's what they did. The dense Vermont forest they were in was beautiful, but Elizabeth had to admit that the conditions today were kind of miserable. The whole area was buzzing with these black flies that were swarming all over Elizabeth's legs and neck, and of course, Elizabeth had forgotten any bug spray. By the time she and Ron had got back to camp, every exposed part of her body was covered in bites, and over the next few hours, those bites turned into welts. Usually, whenever they went camping, Elizabeth and Ron really enjoyed lighting a campfire up at night and sitting out under the stars. But that evening, the black flies were so bad that they just stayed in the camper and played cards. Elizabeth and Ron were in good spirits, though. They'd camped in less than ideal conditions before, from freezing cold to pouring rain, and so they weren't about to let a few bug bites ruin their trip. But by the time Elizabeth changed for bed that night, her arms and legs were an unsightly mess. They didn't hurt, but all the red, swollen welts looked terrible. So she took a few ibuprofen to help with the swelling, and then she climbed into bed. The following day, Elizabeth and Ron got up and packed their bags and they headed home. And even though they had not enjoyed the black flies, they had had an overall nice time and felt energized from their weekend in the fresh mountain air. But for the rest of the week that they were home, Elizabeth battled this terrible on-again, off-again headache, and the welts from all those black fly bites were not going away. Elizabeth spent the following weekend at her niece's house in Long Island, New York. She was excited to catch up and spend some quality time with her family. But the whole time she was there, Elizabeth felt groggy, like she needed a strong cup of coffee. And then when she left and began driving back home, her headache came back full force to the point where it was just this constant, horrible throbbing pain against her temples. When she finally got home, she immediately took some ibuprofen to help with her headache, and then she drank as much water as her stomach would allow. She knew that black fly bites were not toxic, but her body seemed to be taking longer than usual to recover from them. That night, Elizabeth went to sleep early, hoping she'd wake up feeling better. But she didn't. She woke up in a cold sweat, and her stomach churned and her head pounded. She knew right away that she had a fever. Her husband, Ron, grabbed a thermometer from the bathroom, and sure enough, when he took her temperature, it was 101 degrees Fahrenheit. At this point, Elizabeth was really starting to worry. She'd been sick now for more than a week, and she really didn't know how much longer this was going to last. And next weekend, she and Ron were hoping to go camping again in Vermont. They were going to meet up with Elizabeth's cousin and her cousin's husband. Elizabeth was really looking forward to the trip, but she was worried that her sickness, whatever it was, would force them to cancel. All week, Elizabeth tried to take care of herself. She stayed in bed, drank a lot of water, and ate well to help her body overcome this sickness. And finally, the morning before they were supposed to leave for Vermont, her fever broke. Throughout the day, she got better, and by that evening, she felt well enough to go camping. She was thrilled. For the first time in a week, Elizabeth got a good night's sleep, and the next morning, June 22nd, she and Ron loaded up the RV and headed back to Vermont. When Elizabeth and Ron arrived at the Winhall Brook camping ground, it was absolutely downpouring, which made it difficult to find their campsite and hook up their RV, but luckily, Elizabeth's cousin was already there and could help them get set up. When Elizabeth's cousin made a joke about the great weather they were having, Elizabeth thought about her last camping trip in Vermont and decided that she actually preferred this monsoon over swarms of black flies. Elizabeth invited her cousin and her cousin's husband into their RV, planning to cook some dinner while they waited for the rain to subside. But several hours later, the rain still had not let up, and so Elizabeth's cousin and her husband ran back to their own RV, and Elizabeth and Ron, they climbed into bed and they went to sleep, hoping that when they got up, the weather would clear and they could actually go outside and enjoy the outdoors. But the next morning, when Elizabeth woke up, the rain was not remotely on her mind. Instead, she had this blinding headache, and she also knew immediately that her fever was back. Her skin was itching and her eyes felt red. Her mouth felt gritty, almost like it was covered in little bumps. Elizabeth was annoyed, knowing she was likely going to be sick all day and could not participate in anything they were going to do. Elizabeth rubbed her eyes and slowly made her way to the bathroom to brush her teeth. She debated whether she should just ask Ron to take her home, or if she could tough it out in the RV so he could at least still enjoy the vacation. Once in the bathroom, Elizabeth spit out the toothpaste into the sink, and she noticed her spit was bright pink. And when she rinsed her mouth, she tasted blood. She opened her mouth and stuck her tongue out, and her eyes widened as she realized the bumps that she had felt inside of her mouth were these black blood blisters all along her tongue and on the inside of her cheek. Elizabeth started to feel panic rising in her chest, and so she hurried out of the bathroom and over to her cousin's RV. Luckily, her cousin's husband was actually a doctor, and so he had Elizabeth stand in their kitchenette while he looked around the inside of her mouth with a flashlight. And after a minute, he turned off the light and just shook his head. He said he had never seen a condition like this before, and he urged her to go to the hospital. Within minutes, the RV was packed up and Ron was sitting behind the wheel. Elizabeth needed to use the bathroom before they headed off, but when she urinated, it burned. Now Elizabeth was truly worried. These were not flu symptoms. Elizabeth made her way to the passenger seat up front, sitting beside Ron. By this time, her headache was back and worse than ever. She popped an ibuprofen as they pulled out of the campground, but nothing took the edge off the pain in her head or the itching that had developed all over her body. It took 2 hours of driving down winding country roads to get to the nearest emergency room in Brattleboro, Vermont. To Elizabeth, every single time they hit a bump in the road, it made her nauseous with pain. By the time they arrived, Elizabeth was in pure agony. Ron parked the RV, then walked around to the passenger door to help Elizabeth get out. When she saw him, she smiled at him, but she could see his eyes were full of fear. It wasn't until she herself looked in the rearview mirror and saw her reflection that she understood why. Her face was so swollen that she almost didn't recognize herself. About 5 hours later, Dr. Teresa Fitzharris walked into her office at Brattleboro Memorial Hospital, ready to start her overnight shift. She put her purse under her desk, then went to check on Elizabeth, who was her first patient of the night. When Dr. Fitzharris walked into Elizabeth's hospital room and looked at Elizabeth, the doctor tried to hide her shock. Elizabeth's throat, chest, torso, and entire back were covered in a bumpy red rash. Dr. Fitzharris played it cool, but she'd never seen a rash this bad before. Elizabeth also had a fever of 101.6. Her heartbeat was also elevated, and her eyes were so swollen she could barely see out of them. Dr. Fitzharris sat down next to Elizabeth, and then Elizabeth began to recount the last 2 weeks of sickness and misery and all the symptoms she'd experienced since getting bit by all those black flies. Dr. Fitzharris pulled 2 rubber gloves out of a cardboard box in the storage cupboard. She put them on, then gently ran her hand down Elizabeth's arms and back. And as she did this, she frowned. She was confident that this was actually not the result of black fly bites. But Dr. Fitzharris couldn't think of any other condition that would cause a rash like this. And until she could figure it out, Elizabeth was very likely to continue to get worse. At a minimum, the rash could cause serious, lasting damage to Elizabeth's skin. Her eyes could be damaged as well, and there was no telling what this mystery condition could be doing to the inside of Elizabeth's body. Dr. Fitzharris didn't really know where to start with Elizabeth, so she just ordered some x-rays and blood work, and then went to go check on a few other patients while she waited for those things to happen. A little over an hour later, after Elizabeth had gotten the x-ray and done the blood work, Dr. Fitzharris looked over the results on the computer in her office. And to her surprise, Elizabeth's blood work and her x-rays had come back totally normal. And so Dr. Fitzharris was stumped. So she picked up the phone and called one of her colleagues, Dr. David Albright, the infectious disease doctor who was on call that night. She walked Dr. Albright through Elizabeth's symptoms, and she could hear him scribbling notes down as she spoke. And then after Dr. Fitzharris was done talking, Dr. Albright let out a long sigh. He said that most sudden fevers, like the one Elizabeth had, were caused by viral or bacterial infections, and so the problem now was figuring out which one of those she'd contracted. Because Elizabeth had been spending so much time outdoors, Dr. Albright guessed that she might have an insect-borne illness like Lyme disease or Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Dr. Albright told Dr. Fitzharris that he'd be in the next morning, and he promised to make Elizabeth his first stop. In the meantime, Dr. Fitzharris decided to put Elizabeth on antibiotics just in case she did have an insect-borne illness. If left untreated, conditions like Lyme disease or ehrlichiosis can cause organ failure. The doctor just hoped that she hadn't acted too late.
In het licht van de maan, laat de zomer nooit meer weggaan. De rivier stroomt, het water is zo koel. De kinderen spelen, duiken in het poel. De geur van bloemen, het geluid van de wind. Elke dag een avontuur zoals we het beminnen. Als de zomer komt, voel ik me fijn. Het leven is mooi zo dichtbij. We dansen in het licht.
Early the following morning, Elizabeth woke up to the sound of a knock at the door of her hospital room. She squinted through her swollen red eyes and saw the blurry outline of a person walking into the room. He then introduced himself as Dr. Albright and asked if the medicine that Dr. Fitzharris had prescribed was helping at all. Elizabeth groaned and shook her head no. She told Dr. Albright that she could barely see and her rash was more painful than ever, to the point where even a tiny shift in bed was extremely painful. He promised he would do everything he could to help her, and then he said he was very sorry, but he needed Elizabeth right now to sit up straight so he could determine how much her rash had spread. And so Elizabeth tried not to scream as Dr. Albright helped her sit up. Even the slightest touch on her skin was agonizing. As Dr. Albright looked over Elizabeth's body, he could see that the rash had spread, and it did not look like the medicine had helped at all. That meant his suspicion that it might be something like Lyme disease was incorrect. But unfortunately, he didn't really have any idea what else could be making her sick. Elizabeth clenched her teeth as Dr. Albright helped her lie back down. She knew the doctors were doing their best, but the fact that basically nothing had worked so far was still extremely frustrating. She could barely open her eyes and her whole body felt like it was on fire. About an hour later, Dr. Albright reappeared in Elizabeth's doorway. This time, Elizabeth could make out a second figure standing next to Dr. Albright. Dr. Albright explained that he'd brought a colleague with him who was a dermatologist, or a skin doctor, and his name was Dr. Jorge Crespo. Dr. Albright wanted Dr. Crespo to take a closer look at Elizabeth's rash. He hoped that if they could determine what kind of reaction this was, it might inform them what was actually making her sick. Elizabeth braced herself for pain as the doctors once again helped her sit up so Dr. Crespo could look at her. He spent a few moments examining Elizabeth's rash, checking her eyes and the inside of her mouth. Then Elizabeth saw him nod to Dr. Albright, as if to confirm a suspicion. He told Elizabeth that she had a rare but severe kind of allergic reaction called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Dr. Crespo explained that she'd ingested something that triggered an incredibly violent response from her immune system. Her body was so desperate to get the allergen out of her system, it attacked the deepest layers of her skin, causing the blistering rash that now covered her whole body. Soon, he believed, the top layer of her skin would start peeling off. It would look worse before it felt better, almost like she'd suffered a severe burn. None of what the doctor was saying made any sense to Elizabeth. She assured Dr. Crespo that she hadn't ingested anything unusual over the past 2 weeks. She told him again about the black fly bites and wondered if maybe any of the flies could have been carrying some kind of bacteria or virus or fungus that could have infected her. But Dr. Crespo just shook his head no. What made Stevens-Johnson syndrome very unique was not only the reaction, but the thing that caused it: medicine. For reasons doctors do not fully understand, medicines that normally improve people's health can sometimes trigger this life-threatening allergic reaction in certain patients. In Elizabeth's case, Dr. Crespo was confident that the cause was one of the most common, easy-to-get, over-the-counter medicines on the entire planet: ibuprofen. Elizabeth's jaw dropped. She'd been taking ibuprofen steadily for the last 2 weeks to reduce the swelling from all the black fly bites and to alleviate her headaches. Little did she know, the medicine was causing all of these problems. But something didn't make sense to her. She told Dr. Crespo that she'd been taking ibuprofen for as long as she could remember. If she was allergic to it, then why hadn't this happened before? Why didn't she have a big reaction the first time she took it? Dr. Crespo shrugged. He admitted that he really didn't know why Elizabeth would develop this allergic reaction so late in life. Stevens-Johnson syndrome was so rare that the root cause of it was actually still unknown. But at least Elizabeth knew now that she could not take ibuprofen, and Dr. Crespo assured her that if she stopped taking it, that she would recover in about a week or maybe 2. Elizabeth was given steroids to help reduce her symptoms, and a few weeks later, she had recovered enough to go home, just like Dr. Crespo promised. But because her allergic reaction had gone untreated for 2 weeks, some lasting damage had already been done. Elizabeth's eyes had swelled so badly that her tear ducts were permanently damaged and no longer worked. Ever since, she's had to administer saline drops in her eyes every few minutes to keep them working properly. But Elizabeth likes to look on the bright side and has said at least she can still see. In 1991, Charles Holden was on his way home from work when he decided to stop at a fast food restaurant near his house in Harrington, Delaware. After grabbing a quick bite to eat, Charles left the store and got back in his truck. He turned it on and he was about to drive out of the lot when he stopped because there was this man running towards him, waving, trying to flag him down. So Charles put his truck back in park and he rolled his window down to see what this guy wanted. And when this stranger got close enough, he told Charles that his sister was having a baby and he needed a ride to the hospital, which was about 20 minutes away. Charles couldn't tell if this guy was lying. It was super late. He didn't know this guy, and he just had a bad feeling about him. And so he told him, "No, I'm sorry. It's too late. I gotta get home. It's too far out of the way." The stranger immediately looked dejected and turned around and started walking away. And as Charles was watching him go, he felt bad and said, "You know what? Hey, come back here. I'll give you a ride part of the way there." And so the stranger smiled, hopped in his passenger seat, and they took off. Charles drove him approximately 3 miles in the direction he had asked to go before pulling over on the side of the road and telling him, "This is as far as I'm going to take you." Charles lived only about a block away, and he didn't want to drive too far away from home so late at night. But the stranger, upon hearing he was being let out so soon, suddenly became angry and began fumbling in his pocket like he was going to get a knife or some sort of weapon, and he starts screaming at Charles, "Hand over your keys, hand over your wallet, or I'm going to kill you." Charles, meanwhile, was on edge, just being being in the car with this guy because he had a bad feeling about him, and so he immediately jumped into action. He turned off his truck, he ripped the keys out of the ignition, and he leapt out of his truck and started running. Charles saw way off in the distance was a convenience store, and he figured he could run to there and get some help. But as he's running, he turns around and sees the stranger has also leapt out of the car and was now sprinting up to him with a screwdriver in his hand. And this stranger was running really fast. He was gaining on Charles, and soon Charles realized he wasn't going to make it to the convenience store before this guy caught up to him. And so at some point, Charles just stops, he turns around and he puts his hands up and he says, okay, I'll give you a ride wherever you want to go, and then you can have my keys, my wallet, you can have anything you want. And so the stranger runs right up to Charles and he stops and he smiles because he's very pleased with this result. And he pokes him with the screwdriver and kind of gestures for him to go back to the truck. So Charles walks back to the truck with the stranger right behind him with the screwdriver periodically poking him in the back. They finally get to the vehicle and the stranger tells Charles to get in the car and then wait. But as soon as Charles sat down, he fired up his truck and sped off before the stranger could hop in the passenger side door. And so Charles is flying away from this guy. He looks in his rear view mirror and he can see the guy is chasing after him with a screwdriver held over his head, but he sees the stranger at some point just stops, turns around and walks away. Charles was totally relieved that he had escaped this horrible encounter, and he was thinking about calling the police, but ultimately decided he wouldn't because it was his decision to allow some stranger to get in his car in the middle of the night. And so Charles kind of blamed himself for the whole ordeal. What Charles was concerned about, though, was where he had ditched the stranger was not far from his house, and he was worried if he just turned around and drove right back to his house that this guy could recognize the truck and then follow him to his house, and then who knows what could happen. And so Charles decides he's just going to stay outside of town and drive around for a while to make sure this stranger is long gone by the time he comes back. So after about an hour of doing just that, driving around outside of town, Charles goes back into Harrington, Delaware, and he gets on his street, and he's shocked when he sees the stranger who had just tried to kill him is walking down the road right in front of him. But luckily, the stranger did not hear or see Charles pull onto his street, and so Charles immediately throws it in reverse and he gets out of there and he drives off. At this point, Charles decides he needs to tell police because he doesn't know if this stranger actually knows him and that maybe he's targeting him and he's waiting for him at his property. And so he calls 911 and he tells the dispatcher about what had happened earlier and how this guy is now lurking around his property. And the dispatcher tells him they'll send an officer out to him. And so a few minutes later, an officer showed up at the payphone where Charles was, and they told Charles they would escort him back to his property, and if this stranger was still out in the area, they would arrest him. And so the two of them made their way back to Charles's property. They get there, the stranger's long gone, and then Charles goes into his house. There's no sign of a break-in. There's no sign that anyone was near his property. And so Charles thanks the officer. He feels totally relieved. But before the officer leaves, he asks him if he wouldn't mind doing a quick sweep of his mother's property. She lived right behind Charles on the other side of some bushes. He told the officer her name was Dorothy. She was 70 years old and she lived alone. And he just wanted to make sure nothing happened to her. So the officer said, no problem, I'll go check in on her. So the officer leaves Charles and goes across his backyard through those bushes into Dorothy's backyard. And right away, he can see the back window on the back door has been smashed and the door itself is slightly ajar. And so the officer draws their pistol and they go up and they enter the house and they look inside. They're yelling for Dorothy, but there's no answer. It's totally dark in the house. It's totally silent. And so after searching the first floor and finding nothing, they make their way up the flight of stairs and they find blood at the top of the landing. And they follow this trail of blood and it brings them into one of the bedrooms where a woman is sprawled out on a bed. It was Dorothy. She had been stabbed to death. It would turn out, after Charles had ditched the stranger and sped off without him, the stranger, whose name was Gilbert Cannon, began looking for a place to sleep, and the house he ultimately selected just happened to be Charles's mother's house. After Gilbert broke in through her back door, he saw Dorothy coming down the steps to confront him, and because he was worried she'd be able to identify him, he attacked her with a screwdriver. Gilbert would later tell police that the attack on Charles was completely random. He was just at this fast food restaurant, he saw Charles get into his truck, and he thought to himself, if I can get in that guy's truck, I bet I can rob him. And then after this failed robbery, when Gilbert is out looking for a place to sleep and he breaks into this house and this woman comes down the stairs that he attacks and kills, he has no idea that this woman, Dorothy, is Charles's mother. The entire night was one big, horrible coincidence. Gilbert would plead guilty to the murder and would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 1949, 15-year-old problem child Ken Rex McElroy dropped out of school and moved to a tiny farming town called Skidmore, Missouri. There, he began his life of crime, which consisted primarily of theft. At night, he would drive his truck onto Skidmore residents' property, and he would steal their livestock, alcohol, grain, food, antiques, anything he could get his hands on and that he could sell, he would take. And if the owners ever caught him in the act, he would just raise his rifle at them and tell them to go back inside and never report it to the police or he would kill them. And because Rex was this big 270-pound monster of a man who was known for having a bad temper and for being really aggressive, people generally just did what he asked and his crimes went totally unreported. In the rare instances that victims would report Rex's crimes to police, Rex would begin intimidating them and their family by staking out their houses at all hours of the night, or he would just walk directly up to these victims and he would say, "I will kill you if you testify against me." And if none of those tactics worked, Rex used some of his illegal money to hire one of the very best defense lawyers in the entire state, a lawyer who had famously represented the mob, and he would step in and get Rex off of virtually any charge, including the time Rex actually did shoot one of the owners who caught him in the act. Over the years, Rex would use these fear and intimidation tactics not just to make money, but also to prey on young women and girls. In the 1970s, when Rex was in his 40s, he began stalking a local Skidmore girl who was 12 years old named Trina. After assaulting her dozens of times, Rex learned her family was going to be pressing charges against him. So Rex burned down Trina's family's house and killed the family dog, and then threatened to kill the entire family unless they signed paperwork that would legally marry their daughter Trina to Rex. This would protect him legally in case they pressed any charges against him. After the family finally relented and signed off on the marriage, Trina was forced to come live with Rex at his house, and within 2 years, she became pregnant. After the birth of her child, she took her baby and tried to run away from Rex, and she ran back to her family's new house, and she was hiding there, but Rex tracked her down. He took her and their baby back, and then Rex proceeded to burn her family's house down again, and again killed their new family dog. By the end of the 1970s, Rex wasn't only just the most hated person in Skidmore, he was the most destructive person. He had hurt so many people in town, but it seemed like no one could do anything about it. It was like he was untouchable. Then a single piece of candy changed everything. In 1980, one of Rex's children was at a local grocery store in Skidmore when they were caught stealing a piece of candy. When the shopkeeper asked the child to put the candy back, they refused, and it caused this huge fight, and before long, Rex has found out about this huge fight, and Rex, instead of being upset with his child for stealing, he becomes enraged that the shopkeeper had the audacity to accuse his child of a crime. And so Rex began stalking the owner of the store, a 70-year-old man named Bo, along with the rest of Bo's family. At all hours of the night, Rex would just show up in front of their house with a gun slung across his lap, and he would fire shots into the air, and then during the day, he would walk right up to Bo and he would tell him, "I'm going to kill you." And so Bo and his family knew it was only a matter of time before Rex did become violent, and they were right. In July of that year, Rex showed up at Bo's grocery store with a shotgun in hand, and Bo, who was in the back of the shop loading groceries through the back door, he turns around and he sees Rex walking up to him. They have this heated confrontation where at some point Rex just raises a shotgun and he fires a shot into Bo's neck. Bo was gravely wounded, but he would survive, and Rex would actually get arrested and would be charged with attempted murder. And it seemed like, for once, maybe Rex was actually going to get what was coming to him, but he didn't. The attempted murder charge was lowered to just assault, and he was given 2 years in prison, but he would only serve 1 day in jail before being released on bond. And as soon as he was out on bond, he went right to his house and he got his rifle that had a bayonet attached at the end of it, and he went right to the tavern in the middle of Skidmore, and he began telling anybody who would listen that he planned to finish the job, i.e. he was going to kill Bo, and he described in very graphic detail how he planned to do it, which involved this rifle and this bayonet. Patrons that were at the tavern that saw Rex and heard these claims, they were scared for Bo, and so they left the tavern and they told city leaders about these threats. And so city leaders at this point, they've had enough of Rex, and they decide they're going to host this secret meeting that will not include Rex the following morning. So the next morning comes around and all these angry residents, they come to this meeting and they begin discussing, how are we going to handle Rex? We can't use police. We can't use politicians. Nothing can be done. So what are we going to do? How are we going to put an end to his reign of terror? And after a while, they came up with a plan. And after the meeting was done, everybody left the town hall, they got their guns, and they made their way over to the tavern where Rex was seen earlier that morning. About 40 of these armed men surrounded the outside of this tavern, and once they were all in place, another smaller group of men that were all armed walked inside the tavern, and they saw Rex sitting at the bar with Trina sitting right next to him. And so these men, they walk up right behind Rex, uncomfortably close, right behind him, and they just stand there with their guns looking at him. And at some point, Rex turns around and sees them, and he's about to lash out and start fighting them, but he realizes he's totally outnumbered, and these men that are standing all around him, they look like they mean business. And so he stands up, he grabs Trina, and he brushes past them, trying to act tough, and he walks out of the tavern. When he gets outside, he's taken aback at this additional group of armed men, which is much larger, who are all standing there just looking in at him. And so Rex at this point becomes visibly frightened, but he grabs Trina and he calmly walks out to his truck, which is parked a little ways out in front of the tavern. He gets in the driver's side, she hops in the passenger side, and Rex lights a cigarette up, he turns on his truck, and he's about to try to drive away when a gunshot rings out, and Rex immediately slumps forward onto his wheel. One of the Skidmore residents runs up to the truck, they open up the passenger side, and they grabbed Trina, who was unhurt, pulled her out, and rushed her to safety. Once she was clear, the other residents with their guns just moved in on the truck, and for 20 seconds they opened fire on Rex. After the shooting was over, nobody called an ambulance. Everyone just stood there and watched as the town bully died. In all, there were 46 witnesses that were there when Rex was murdered, but they all said they had either not seen the shooting or they didn't know who the shooter was. And despite a lengthy federal investigation, none of the witnesses ever changed their stories. And so as a result, no one was ever charged with Rex's murder. Years later, a Skidmore resident, when asked what happened here, they just said, that man needed a killing. On the morning of March 18th, 1990, a young woman named Karen parked her car just outside of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. This famous museum is home to over 15,000 pieces of priceless art from ancient Rome, medieval Europe, Renaissance Italy, Asia, the Islamic world, and 19th century France and America. The outside of this 4-story building is strikingly plain, but inside is strikingly gorgeous. There is this lush green open-air courtyard that sits right in the middle of the museum that all of the galleries look down into. Karen was an art enthusiast, and she was a security guard at this museum, and that day she was on duty. After parking her car, she got out and walked her way over to the employee entrance, and there she pressed the buzzer and announced her arrival to the 2 night shift guards that she would be relieving. But after a few seconds, the night shift guards did not respond to her, and they did not unlock the door. And so after a little while, Karen pressed the buzzer again and said, "I'm here, can you please open the door?" But again, the guards that were on duty did not respond back to her, and the door did not open. This was highly unusual, so Karen left the door, found a payphone, and called the chief of security for the museum, who lived out in town, and told him she couldn't get in the building. And so about 10 minutes later, the chief of security shows up, and he takes Karen, and he walks her around to the other side of the building. He leads her up an outdoor flight of stairs to another entrance to the museum. He pulls out a big ring of keys, he finds the right one, and he opens the door. The entrance they were going through placed them in this dark hallway that stretched out straight in front of them, and then at the very end of the hallway on the right was this very brightly lit room that the door was wide open to, and that was the security office where the guards were supposed to be. And so Karen and the chief, they begin walking down this hallway expecting to get to the end of it and look inside this room and see these guards and get an explanation for why they didn't buzz Karen in the first place. But when they reach the end of the hallway and they look in this office, there's nobody inside of there. And now that they were up close, they could see the door leading into the security office had been smashed open. In fact, the doorknob to this door had been smashed off and was laying on the ground. And then next to it, right in front of them, was this metal crowbar. And then above them, the one camera that would have seen whatever had happened in the hallway, it had been turned around and was facing the wall. So Karen and the chief, they know they've stumbled on something that's probably really bad. They don't know know what it is. They don't know if there's still people inside the museum. They don't know where the guards are. So the chief just grabs the crowbar for protection, and he and Karen run into the office and they call police. Although they didn't know it yet, Karen and the chief had just discovered one of the most famous crimes in history. The night before, 23-year-old security guard Rick Abath trudged his way down the walkway towards the employee entrance of the museum. He and another young man named Randy were scheduled to work the overnight shift that night. Rick hated his job at the museum because it was incredibly boring, but Rick didn't really have many other employment opportunities to choose from. He was a guy that had dropped out of music school and spent most of his time smoking marijuana, drinking beer, and playing in his friend's rock band. And so he just kept this job that he hated. Once Rick got inside the museum, he walked over to the office where he found his partner that night, Randy, was already sitting behind the desk. After chatting with him for a few minutes, Rick said he would do the first set of security rounds, and so he grabbed a walkie-talkie and a flashlight and he headed out to the exhibit halls. Almost immediately, a fire alarm went off. Rick went to the area where it was going off and he investigated and did not see a fire, and so he just turned the alarm off. The building was very old, and it wasn't uncommon for their electronics to fail or glitch. And so after this, Rick didn't think much of it. He continued doing his security rounds, and after about 30 more minutes of that, he made his way back down to the security office where he traded places with Randy. Rick took the seat behind the desk, and Randy took the walkie-talkie and flashlight and headed out into the exhibits. About 30 minutes later, while Randy was still doing his security rounds, Rick had his head down on the desk when he heard the sound of the buzzer coming from one of the outside doors. He lifted his head up and he looked at the screen that was connected to the camera, looking down at whoever was outside of this door, and he saw there were two police officers standing right outside the door. And so he reached over and he pressed the intercom button and he said, "Hey, can I help you?" And the officers said they were there responding to a disturbance call. Can they come inside? Now, Rick didn't know what this was about. He assumed it must have to do with maybe the fire alarm that had gone off earlier, or maybe somebody outside had seen someone trying to break in and they had called it in. But either way, he felt like it was important enough that he should let them in, even though it was against protocol to allow anyone into the museum after hours, including police. And so the two officers, they come through the doors and they wind up in the hallway right outside of the security office. And there's a window into the security office, so both the officers and Rick can see each other. And the officers immediately say to Rick, "Hey, are you working alone tonight?" And Rick says, "No, my partner is out doing security rounds. He'll be back soon." And so the officers just kind of nod their heads and they're looking around the room for a second. And one of them, as he glances at Rick again, he does kind of a double take and he goes, "Wait a minute, I think I know you. There's a warrant out for your arrest. You need to come out here and show me your ID." And so Rick is caught completely off guard, but he just kind of instinctively does what he's told because it's a police officer. And so Rick stands up, he walks out of the office, he goes out into the hallway, and as he's about to present his ID to the inquiring officer, the officer just grabs him, pushes him up against the wall, and handcuffs him. And so before Rick can say anything, Randy, his partner, comes back from doing his security rounds. He walks into the hall and has no idea what's going on. The other officer, the one that had not handcuffed Rick, grabs Randy and does the same thing, presses him up against the wall and handcuffs him. And so as Randy and Rick are standing there up against the wall with their hands behind their back, they're looking at each other, they're looking around thinking, what's going on here? And at some point, Randy just blurts out, "Why are we being arrested?" And that's when one of the officers just says, "Oh, you're not being arrested. You're being robbed." Rick and Randy were led by the imposter cops down into the basement of this building where they were bound and gagged with duct tape. And then these two thieves proceeded to spend the next 81 minutes walking all around the museum, ultimately stealing 13 pieces of art before destroying the security footage and then fleeing the building. Rick and Randy were discovered unhurt later that morning by police, still tied up in the basement. Despite dozens of suspects, numerous viable theories, and a massive monetary reward, these two art thieves were never caught and remain at large today. As for the 13 pieces of stolen art, one of which includes the extremely rare Rembrandt painting called The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, which is his only seascape in existence, they are still unaccounted for. And combined, they are worth a staggering $500 million. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to teach the like button how to drive in your car. And then on the day of their first lesson, show up in an 18-speed transmission semi-tractor trailer truck. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. A middle-aged mother named Kay was fast asleep in a remote forest in Indonesia when she heard her phone ring. Her hand drifted over to the nightstand by her bed, but by the time she grabbed her phone, the call had gone to voicemail. When Kay looked at the screen, she felt a bolt of fear. She had 2 obviously urgent text messages, as well as 3 missed calls, all from her sister in Hawaii. And in the text messages, her sister was trying to tell Kay that her son had a fast-moving infection that actually could kill him, and so she needed to get home right now. Kay's trip to Indonesia to work on a farm had been her adventure of a lifetime, but now all she could think about was her son. 2 days and 6,000 miles of travel later, Kay finally arrived by her son's bedside, and she was shocked at what she saw. When she had left for Indonesia, her son had been this healthy, tanned, surfer young man, and now he was sickly looking with a tangle of wires and tubes coming off of every part of his body. As Kay began to cry, she kept asking the same question. How could this have happened? From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please stop by the Follow Button's house while they're cleaning, and then kindly offer to dust off all their furniture. Once they say yes, open up the vacuum and empty all of its contents all over their furniture, and then leave. This episode is called Surf's Up. It was the afternoon of December 24th, 2008, and while most residents of Hilo, Hawaii were celebrating Christmas Eve, 23-year-old Graham McCumber was just getting home from a long day of construction work. Graham backed his pickup truck into his driveway, but he didn't go inside his home. Instead, he stayed just long enough to grab his surfboard, put it in his truck, and then zoom off towards the ocean a few minutes away. Surfing was the only thing that helped Graham unwind after 8 hours of hoisting building materials at a construction site. Graham drove with the windows down on the balmy evening, taking in the smell of sea salt as he pulled into his usual parking spot. He spent a few minutes wrestling on his wetsuit, then he grabbed his board and ran toward the water. Graham surfed until dusk had settled over the beach, feeling all the stress of the day melting away. Then he paddled to shore, toweled himself off, and hopped back in his truck. By the time he got home, it was already dark, and he realized he was running late. A friend had asked him to join a holiday potluck dinner, and he still had to make something, and so he didn't have much time. Graham jumped in the shower, and then afterwards he went outside to the large garden behind his house. Graham had planted this garden with his mom, whose name was Kay. Normally, Kay lived with him at the house, but she was working on an organic farming project in the remote forests of Indonesia. Like his mom, Graham preferred an organic and holistic lifestyle and loved growing his own food. He even practiced herbal medicine like his mom and wanted to be a healer someday. And Graham just loved to share the fruits and veggies from the garden. So he harvested a few bunches of kale, then threw together a salad, and dashed off to the Christmas Eve dinner party. Graham would spend the evening laughing and celebrating the holiday with friends, and then when he got home and climbed into bed, he felt great. The next morning, though, on Christmas Day, Graham woke up with a splitting headache, even though he had not drunk any alcohol at the party the night before. He lay in bed without moving for a few minutes, and slowly the throbbing subsided. He rolled out of bed and stood to get dressed, but then his arm started to itch. And so he began to scratch it, but just as he did, another itch began on his leg. Soon, Graham felt itchy all over his body, but when he checked the spots that itched, there was no visible rash of any kind on his skin. And no matter how hard he scratched every spot, there was just no relief. Graham had never felt this way before, and it made him really anxious. He wished he could talk to his mom and ask her advice, because she would know what bundle of herbs to chew or what tea to drink, but obviously she was gone in Indonesia. However, his mother's sister, Aunt Lynn, she knew a lot about holistic cures too. So he called her, and she told him to come over right away, and so Graham grabbed his car keys and headed out the door, itching himself the whole time. The drive to Lynn's took about 15 minutes, but today it felt like an eternity for Graham. By the time he arrived, Graham's arms and legs were bright red from all the scratching he was doing, and his stomach was starting to churn. He felt like he was going to throw up. He let himself in through the front door and called out to his aunt. She came in from the kitchen with a concerned look on her face, just as Graham collapsed onto the couch. Lynn asked Graham to tell him how he was feeling, and he told his aunt that the itching all over his body felt like it was actually under his skin, and so he just couldn't actually itch it. And he said his stomach felt like it was being twisted into knots. Lynn quizzed him on what he'd eaten or touched over the past 24 hours, but Graham assured her that he hadn't done anything new and was not allergic to anything he'd touched or eaten at the potluck. Lynn thought for a moment, and then she told Graham she'd be right back. Graham closed his eyes and tried to relax as his aunt went outside to her garden. A few moments later, Aunt Lynn came back with a handful of peppermint and some other herbs for his stomach and headache. Graham had used these traditional remedies before, and in the past they had given him some comfort. And so he thanked his aunt and took what she had given him, and then after a while, once he felt like his stomach was settling down, he said goodbye to his aunt and headed home to try to get some rest. When Graham got home, he flopped into his bed and closed his eyes. But although his stomach was feeling better and his headache was gone, the itching had now turned into a deep burning sensation. It felt like his blood vessels were on fire, and the throbbing in his temple had come back. It was a dull pain while Graham was lying down, but the moment he stood up, it felt like someone was driving an ice pick into his forehead. That afternoon, he called his aunt. Most of their family believed in these traditional remedies. It was now time to go to the hospital. About an hour later, Lynn tried to hide her worry as she helped Graham walk into the emergency room at the Hilo Medical Center. And as Graham sat down on a chair along the wall, Lynn felt helpless because she could see that Graham was in so much pain he was now crying. Lynn had never seen her healthy, athletic nephew so sick. She tried her best to appear calm as she checked him in at the reception desk. Then she took a seat next to Graham and filled out his paperwork for him. She actually knew his medical information by heart because they were very, very close. She was essentially his second mom. After a short wait, the receptionist called Graham's name, and a nurse helped him stand up and then walked him through the doors into the patient area. Lynn sat in the waiting room for about 30 minutes before a nurse came out and invited her to come see Graham. When Lynn walked into the exam room, a doctor was in the middle of explaining that they were still waiting for some tests to come back. Once he had those results, he'd have a better idea of what was going on with Graham. Lynn could see Graham grimace. He told the doctor he was in a ton of pain, like a level 10 out of 10, if not higher. He asked if there was anything they could give him for the pain while he waited. The doctor hesitated, then said if Graham's pain was really that bad, they could start him on a morphine drip. Morphine is a very, very strong painkiller. Graham immediately nodded yes. If it would make the pain go away, he wanted it. Lynn was shocked. Morphine was a serious drug, but she knew how much pain Graham was in and understood why it could be necessary. Aunt Lynn gave her nephew a comforting smile and then sent a text to Graham's mother, Kay, letting her know that her son was sick. But they were at the hospital and Graham was getting cared for, and Lynn promised Kay that she would update her if Graham got any worse. A few hours later, Lynn was walking back from the vending machines when she saw Graham's doctor approach his bed. Lynn felt relieved, assuming they must have a diagnosis, and so she walked over, and she asked the doctor if she should go home now and maybe grab an overnight bag for Graham. But the doctor told her that wouldn't be necessary. He said all the tests came back negative, He thought that Graham simply had a serious case of the flu, and he was going to discharge him. Lynn couldn't believe what she was hearing. She reminded the doctor that Graham's pain was so intense that he was put on morphine. Once it wore off, she was worried he'd just end up right back at the hospital. Lynn could see the doctor was skeptical. She wondered if maybe he thought Graham was faking his pain to get a morphine fix. And so she assured the doctor that Graham was a really good kid and was in legitimate pain and just needed help. The doctor promised Lynn that he believed Graham was in severe pain, but his symptoms were consistent with just a bad flu and did not require further treatment at the hospital. He was pretty sure Graham would be better in a couple of days, but he told Lynn to bring him back if he did take a turn for the worse. Lynn disagreed, but there was nothing she could do. The ER was discharging Graham, and she had to take him home. So Lynn waited while Graham signed a few release forms and then helped him back to the car. Once they were back at her house, Lynn helped Graham ease onto the couch, and then she handed him the TV remote. Then she threw his favorite blanket over him and made him the ginger tea he'd asked for earlier. Then she watched with worry as Graham barely sipped his tea and then complained that his head was still hurting and that his arms were starting to itch a little bit. Lynn had no idea what was wrong with her nephew, but she was pretty sure that Graham was suffering from something that was far more serious than the flu, and whatever it was, holistic remedies might not be enough to cure it. She just hoped that he would start to feel better overnight. But the next morning, when Lynn woke up, she heard Graham crying out for help from the guest bathroom. Lynn ran to the bathroom and knocked on the door and asked what was wrong, and from the other side of the door, Graham said that his bladder felt really full, but he couldn't urinate. Then, in a more quiet voice, Graham said he felt like he was dying. Lynn knew that Graham was right to be worried. If he couldn't relieve himself, his bladder could literally burst. A ruptured bladder can lead to blood infection, kidney failure, and even death. And so Lynn told Graham that they were getting back in the car, going back to the hospital, and they were not going to leave until Graham got the help he needed. When they arrived at the hospital, Lynn helped Graham to crawl out of the back seat where he had been lying. Then he leaned on her as he hobbled towards the sliding glass double doors that led to the emergency room. As they got closer, a nurse noticed them and ran toward them with a wheelchair. Graham was very grateful as the nurse helped him sit down, and right away he kind of slumped over in the chair. The nurse asked what was going on, and as Graham cradled his aching head, Lynn explained that her nephew was no longer able to urinate. Graham could feel the nurse speed up as she pushed him inside. Minutes later, an ER doctor explained to him that they needed to put in a catheter to relieve the pressure on his bladder. From there, they'd admit him to the hospital for treatment. A little after midnight, Lynn went in to check on Graham and found him lying awake staring up at the ceiling. She very gently squeezed his arm, and Graham yelped in pain. Lynn snapped her hand back and apologized. She had barely touched her nephew, and he had reacted like she had clamped his arm with a vice grip. Lynn told Graham she'd be right back, then went to find the doctor. The doctor came back with her to the room and then approached Graham's bedside and took a pen out of his coat pocket. He lightly ran the top of the pen along Graham's arm. And again, Graham flinched and told the doctor it really hurt when he did that. The doctor nodded and then did the same thing with the pen down Graham's legs. And as he did it, Graham winced and gritted his teeth. The doctor told Graham that the extreme sensitivity to touch was likely due to meningitis, an inflammation of the tissues that surround the brain and spinal cord. When Lynn heard this, she felt her stomach drop. If Graham did have meningitis, she knew he could spend the rest of his life battling seizures, brain damage, hearing loss, or worse. Meningitis could even be fatal. The doctor said that in order to be sure, they had to perform what's called a spinal tap. That meant he needed to insert a large needle into Graham's spine. Lynn saw Graham's face go white. She could understand why he was nervous. If even a mild touch hurt him, how would a needle going into his spine feel? But if they were going to figure out what was wrong with Graham, he would have to go through with it. Once the anesthetic was working on Graham, the doctor carefully inserted the needle in between two of Graham's vertebrae. Lynn squeezed her nephew's hand as the doctor then pulled back on the syringe and filled it with Graham's spinal fluid. After the doctor had pulled the needle out of Graham's spine, Graham relaxed and let out a sigh of relief. Lynn put on a brave face for her nephew. She was glad the procedure was over, but she had a sneaking suspicion that Graham's struggle was only just beginning. A few hours later, Graham's mother, Kay, stared in disbelief at her cell phone. While she was asleep on the other side of the world in Indonesia, she had somehow missed 2 text messages and 3 phone calls from her sister Lynn. The sisters had been texting for the past couple of days, so Kay was already aware that Graham was in the hospital, but this barrage of attempts to contact her could only mean one thing: something bad must be happening with her son. Her heart was pounding as she called her sister back, steeling herself for devastating news. When Aunt Lynn answered, she was crying. She told Kay that Graham had just tested positive for meningitis and was now fighting for his life. She needed to come home right now. It took Kay 2 full days of travel to go from the remote forests of Indonesia all the way back to Hawaii. And as soon as she landed, she hopped in a cab and went straight to the hospital. The moment she saw her sister, Lynn, waiting in the parking lot, Kay broke down in tears. Kay had spent the whole flight mentally preparing herself to see her son in the condition he was in, but she still felt totally shocked as she rounded the corner into his room and actually saw him. A tangle of wires and tubes seemed to be attached to every part of his body. He was pale and sickly looking, nothing like the healthy, tanned surfer that Kay had left a few months ago. His blonde hair was greasy and clung to his face. Graham was awake, but barely. His voice was hoarse as he said hello to his mom and gave a weak smile. Kay immediately rushed over and gave her son a hug. She promised Graham she was there to help and she would work with his doctors to make sure he got better. A few minutes later, Graham's doctor walked in and updated Kay on Graham's condition. Although they knew he had meningitis, the doctor believed it was actually a sign of a deeper underlying disease in his brain and spinal cord. One big hint was Graham's continued inability to urinate, something called Ellsberg syndrome. It really didn't make any sense that Graham could have this condition. Ellsberg syndrome is most often caused by West Nile disease, a mosquito-borne illness that has never been detected in Hawaii, and Graham had never tested positive for West Nile disease. But at least doctors could test for West Nile, which causes swelling in the brain. Other potential triggers for Ellsberg syndrome were even more devastating to the brain, but there was no test for these conditions until the disease was more advanced. So Graham's doctors were still essentially at square one. Kay just prayed they could keep her son stable long enough to find the answer. On the morning of January 12th, almost 3 weeks after Graham first got sick, Kay nodded off in the chair at the foot of her son's hospital bed. She woke up as her sister, Aunt Lynn, walked through the door with a cup of coffee in each hand. While Kay sipped her drink, she noticed her son shift a little bit. It had been almost 10 days since she'd arrived, and the doctors still didn't have a confirmed diagnosis for her son. And now her son's eyelids were fluttering rapidly, the look in his eyes seemed distant, and then when Kay stood up and shook his leg and asked if he could hear her, Graham didn't respond. Behind Kay, Aunt Lynn, who was watching this, immediately punched the call button on the wall. Seconds later, a nurse bolted into the room, ushering Kay and Lynn out of the way. The nurse took one look at the monitor tracking Graham's vital signs and began shaking Graham's leg. When he didn't respond, she went to find a doctor. Moments later, Kay held her breath as nurses ripped cords and wires out of her son and then pushed his bed as fast as they could toward the door and down the hall. As Kay watched helplessly with a look of absolute fear on her face, a nurse came over to her and gently explained that Graham had just fallen into a coma, and now he needed to be transferred to the intensive care unit. Half an hour later, a nurse escorted Kay to Graham's bedside in the ICU. Now he was hooked up to a ventilation machine just so he could breathe. A feeding tube was down his throat. Graham was on life support now. Without these machines, he would die. Graham's doctor assured Kay that Graham was stabilized for the time being, but the meningitis was only getting worse, and the Hilo Medical Center didn't have the resources to care for Graham any further. They needed to transfer him to a bigger hospital in Honolulu, the capital city of Hawaii. The medevac chopper was ready for Graham later that morning, and Kay, who was inside the chopper as well, placed a hand on her son as he lay on his stretcher, and then she watched as the helicopter lifted off the ground, and the ground below her gave way to a clear blue ocean. A short time later, Kay and Graham landed at the hospital in Honolulu, and Graham was quickly whisked away to the ICU at that hospital. By late afternoon, Kay once again watched helplessly as medical staff huddled around her gravely ill son, going over notes and trying to talk about what this could be. That night, Kay made her way to the nearby hotel that one of the nurses had recommended. But when she laid down to sleep, every time she closed her eyes, all she could see was her son lying unconscious in his hospital bed. Then she thought of the long list of drugs the doctor had prescribed for Graham, all names she couldn't remember or even begin to pronounce. They would regulate Graham's heartbeat and blood pressure and keep his organs from failing, and she knew these drugs were vital to Graham's survival. But they were also very hard on his body, putting him at risk for things like pneumonia, blood clots, and worse. And so, as Kay lay there in her hotel bed, unable to sleep, she thought to herself that she just had to find some way to help her son. She just could not sit on the sidelines anymore. And so the next morning, Kay walked into her son's room with a paper bag full of supplies. She took out a jar of noni juice, a tropical fruit with natural antioxidants, and after getting her son's doctor's permission, she fed Graham the noni through his stomach tube, hoping it would help his immune system fight off this mysterious disease. Then Kay grabbed a box of long steel pins. She lifted Graham's shirt and administered acupuncture all over Graham's stomach. Kay believed the acupuncture would protect Graham's organs, both from the disease and from any side effects of the various medications required to keep Graham alive. 2 days later, Kay moved around her son's bed, administering more acupuncture treatment, and all the while talking to him as though he could hear her. She fully believed Graham was getting better. She couldn't explain it, but it was like his presence was slowly refilling the room, and it was getting stronger and stronger with each passing day. Kay was certain that her traditional healing methods, combined with modern medicine, would help Graham's body heal. In fact, Kay was so focused on her work that morning that she barely noticed a doctor walking up behind her. He introduced himself as the hospital's infectious disease expert, and he said he had news for her, but unfortunately, it was not good news. Her son's illness had finally advanced far enough that doctors could now tell whether he was suffering from an extremely rare but utterly devastating condition. And unfortunately, the doctor said, the results came back positive. He held up an image from Graham's most recent MRI and pointed to dozens of tiny white spots on Graham's brain. He told Kay that each one of those spots represented a microscopic hole in Graham's brain tissue that were created by parasites living in his head. The doctor explained that Graham's increasingly debilitating symptoms had been caused by these parasites, called roundworm larvae, as they burrowed inside of him. Kay was so caught off guard and horrified by what she was hearing that she could barely speak for a second, but then finally she just asked, how could this happen? The doctor explained that Graham's condition is extremely rare and can only happen under very specific circumstances. These roundworm larvae, these worms, grow in the lungs of rats and then are excreted alive through the rat's feces. And then sometimes a snail will crawl over those rat feces, and the snail will become infested with these roundworm larvae as well. And if a person accidentally were to eat that infected snail or its slime, the roundworm larva can enter that person's digestive system. The doctor said that the roundworm larvae had eaten their way through Graham's intestines and eventually made their way to Graham's brain, which is what made all those microscopic holes. But it wasn't the holes that were making Graham so sick. The roundworm larvae were dying once they reached Graham's brain, and their decaying bodies were infecting the brain tissue. The condition, the doctor said, was known as rat lungworm disease. The doctor told Kay that he was terribly sorry, but he did not see a path to recovery for her son. At best, Graham would live in a vegetative state. Although his body could live, his mind would be gone. He probably would not be able to do much more than open and close his eyes. At this, Kay actually just started shaking her head. This didn't make sense to her. She was certain that Graham could hear her when she spoke to him. He had smiled when she asked him questions, like he understood what she was saying. And through her tears, Kay told the doctor that she refused to give up on her son. Over the next few weeks, Graham's condition was up and down as his body fought off several dangerous infections. Kay trusted all the doctor's abilities, but she just felt like Western medicine alone would not actually be able to help Graham. And so, in between drug treatments to fight off the parasites in Graham's body, Kay gave her son supplements of herbs like spirulina, chlorella, and a Chinese herb called Xing Nao Wan. She had heard these treatments helped with nerve function, and she hoped they might allow Graham to recover faster. Kay also continued feeding her son noni juice and continued giving him acupuncture. And through all of Kay's treatments, her son's eyes would periodically open and close. But the doctors told Kay that it was just a reflex and not something he was doing consciously. Then, one day in March, Kay noticed that Graham's eyes became more animated. It seemed like they were focusing on her. Kay immediately pressed the call button, and soon Graham's doctor came in, and he confirmed that it did look like Graham was starting to wake up. Kay held her son's hand and encouraged him to make a noise, do something, make some sign that he was still there. For a while, the only sound Graham made was his labored breathing. But Kay kept at it, constantly asking her son to give some sign, and then kind of as a joke, she would say to her son, as his labored breathing continued, that he sounded like Darth Vader. And when she said that, Graham's eyes seemed to focus again, and he took what looked like a big deep breath, and then in a very weak voice he said, "Luke, I am your father." Kay almost screamed with excitement. Not only was her son awake, he could speak. She reached down to hug him, and amazingly, Graham hugged her back. The doctors who were watching this were just as amazed as Kay was. Kay liked to think that her treatments had helped support the vital work the doctors had done to keep her son alive. Together, they'd done everything in their power to give Graham's body a fighting chance against this parasite, and against all odds, he had overcome it. Within a few days, Graham was conscious enough for his mother to explain what had happened to him and how he had gotten this terrible disease from a snail. Graham asked how that could possibly be because he could not recall eating any snails, and his mother kind of shrugged and said, we may never know for sure how this happened. But she then told her son that most likely, on the night that he had that potluck dinner on Christmas Eve, when he harvested the kale, perhaps there was a snail on the kale that had this disease in it. When she said that, Graham's mouth fell open in shock. He thought back to that night and the bunches of kale he hastily gathered from their garden, and he'd been in such a rush to head out the door, he had forgotten to wash the kale. And so had there been an infected snail or infected snail slime on this kale, it's totally possible that Graham could have accidentally ingested it. Thankfully, nobody else at the potluck had gotten sick. On April 30th, after more than 4 months in the hospital, Graham was finally able to return home. Over the next 2 years, he relearned how to walk and talk. Today, he rides his bike to a local community college, where he's studying to become a physical therapist. A teenager named Eben and his father would regularly go hunting in the Georgia backcountry. When Eben turned 14, his father befriended a very wealthy landowner in Georgia who offered them access to one of his best private hunting areas. And just a couple of days later, on October 5th, Eben and his father would take him up on the offer. They woke up super early and they drove out to the edge of this property that was actually fenced in. And they went to a main gate where they had the combo that this guy had given them. They punched in the combo, opened up the gate, drove in, shut the gate, locked it, and then continued down the access road. They followed this road for about 2 miles where it came to a stop right outside of this huge forest. They parked their truck, they got out, they put on their gear, and in the pre-morning darkness began hiking into the woods. Even though they were there primarily to hunt, Eben and his father secretly enjoyed just hiking around the woods and camping out, and any chance they got to extend their hunting trips, they would, even if the hunting wasn't good. And so since they spent a ton of time in the woods together, they noticed almost immediately when they walked into this particular forest that something was off. There's no birds, there's no animals. Silence. It's just totally silent. The only sounds they heard that were not them was a single plane that passed overhead. Although they found this very odd, they figured, you know what, this is private property, not a lot of people are out here. I'm sure as soon as we showed up, the animals were aware of us and they've scattered. They finally make it out to the hunting stand that the owner had told them about. They get all settled in, they're getting ready to see some animals. And all day long, they don't see a single animal. They don't hear a single animal. In fact, again, it is just completely silent. Frustrated, they began packing up their stuff, making their way down off the stand, and they started looking for a place to make camp for the night. And Eben's father suggested, well, hey, there's obviously nothing over here. It's been quiet all day. Why don't we walk deeper into the woods a little ways, set up camp there, so tomorrow we have a better chance of seeing some animals. So they hiked for about an hour farther away from where they parked their truck, and they reached this clearing, which is perfect for setting up their camp. And so they set up their tent, and Eben's father says, hey, we still got some daylight. Do you want to go try our luck and see if we can see some animals out here now? Eben's like, yeah, why not? So they hike a little ways away from their campsite and they set up their blind, and once again, they don't see any animals. It's totally quiet. And so they turn around and they start heading back. As soon as they could see their campsite, which really was just their tent, they noticed that their tent was now collapsed. And Eben's father turns to him and says, oh, it must have been the wind. And Eben says, no, it couldn't have been the wind, because all day today we have been commenting on how quiet it is and how the fact that there's no weather, no wind, no anything is heightening the fact that it's completely silent. So it could not have been wind. So Eben's father is like, well, when you set the tent up, did you not put the posts into the eyelets? Did you not build it correctly? And Eben's like, no, I've made that tent like 1,000 times. I know it was set up correctly. They walk into their campsite and they look down at their tent, and they're really confused at what they see. The two rods that go in an X over the top of the tent that thread through nylon loops and then anchor at 4 different points on the base of the tent, well, they had been removed from the 4 corners. And if you know how a tent works, it works on tension. And once you have a rod anchored in 2 points, it doesn't just pop out. It's anchored at 2 sides. It's actually difficult to remove each anchor. Once one is out, the other comes out easily. But basically, the rod would need to break in order for it to come out of those anchor points, or someone would have to come over and remove it. And they didn't remove them, and none of the rods were broken. Which leaves them with either they failed to set up their tent, even though they had distinct and clear memories of setting it up and double checking it was set up because they put gear inside of it, or someone came over to their campsite while they were gone and undid the 4 corners. They decide, you know what, it can't be some stranger coming over here because we're the only ones with the gate combo. This is private property and no one could have been here. And why would they do that if they came to our campsite? Why would they randomly collapse our tent and then vanish? So it had to be us. We must have not made the tent. And while they didn't really believe that they had not made their tent, they convinced themselves that that's what happened because the alternative was just too bizarre and frankly terrifying to consider. So they build their tent and they make a little fire and they stay up for a little while chatting before being tired and saying, okay, let's just go to bed. They extinguish the fire, they get in the tent, and they both fall asleep. A couple hours later, Eben wakes up suddenly and he's not sure if he's dreaming or not, but he thinks he hears someone laughing a couple hundred meters behind their tent off in the woods. Eben instinctively turns to make sure his dad is still in the tent with him, and he is. And then Eben starts listening really intently to what's happening outside. And all he can hear is silence, like it's been since they got in the woods. He doesn't hear any more laughter, and so he says, okay, I must have just been dreaming, and there wasn't any laughter out there, and eventually Eben goes back to sleep. A little while later, Eben wakes up suddenly again, except this time his dad is already awake and looking around anxiously. And Eben sits up and goes, what's going on? And his dad goes, shh. And he goes, can you hear that? And Eben listens, and to his horror, he hears laughing. He wasn't dreaming before. Eben also realizes the laughter is not coming from the same area he heard it. It's now coming from the opposite direction and it's a lot closer to them. Eben very quietly and carefully explains to his dad that he actually heard this laughter a couple hours earlier, and Eben's father turns to Eben and says, "Before we came out here, I asked the owner, should we expect any other hunters or campers or anybody nearby? And the owner said, this is private property and it's fenced in. There is no one there but you guys." After this revelation, they both turn their attention back to just listening because they're hoping this is just going to stop and whatever this is just going to leave. But it doesn't leave. They hear footsteps running towards them from way off in the forest, and it's so quiet, it's really easy to hear these footsteps. And whatever this is charging towards them. And then it comes to a complete stop right at the edge of their clearing. At this point, Eben is now grabbing onto his father. Eben's father is holding onto his rifle, and he's getting ready to open the tent to confront whatever is out there. And right before he grabs the zipper, this person, whatever it is, starts laughing again, and it's practically right on top of them. It's so loud. They can hear it clear as day right there, right outside their tent. And Eben's father takes a deep breath. He grabs the zipper, and as soon as he begins moving it, the sound the zipper made causes the laughter to stop. They don't hear footsteps, so they know probably something's still out there. But the laughter stops like it's recognized that they're making noise. They're right there. There they are. They're in the tent. Eben's father freezes with his hand on this zipper, and he's debating whether he should go outside or not. And before he can even make that decision, whatever this thing is turns around and runs back into the woods, and it's just gone. And for several minutes, they just sit like that in total silence, praying that whatever this is gone for good. And after several minutes, when they don't hear anything, there's no more laughing, there's no more running, Eben's father re-zips up the tent, puts his hand back down, and they're both left just sitting there thinking, what the heck just happened? Eben and his father would stay up all night, and they would barely speak because whatever this thing was had heard them when they moved the zipper. And so they were really afraid of making any sound, even little sounds, because it's so quiet, sound travels really far, and they don't know who or what is out there. And so in silence, holding their guns, they're just waiting for the sun to come up. And as soon as it did, they were up and out of there, literally running out of the forest, checking over their shoulder the whole time, all the way back to their truck. And so to this day, they have no idea who or what the heck was running around out there. And they told the owner of the property about it. And the owner just said, it's not possible. We have a totally gated in private piece of property, and there are cameras watching the only entrance. And you are the only ones that went in or out over that time period. And prior to that, we monitor this property. Nobody else was in there. In the summer of 2013, a young woman named Katie and her father decided to go camping at one of their favorite campgrounds in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Katie loved going camping with her father because he was this totally accomplished outdoorsman, and he used to be a wilderness guide for much of his life, and so she just always felt like she was in great hands whenever she was out in the wild with him, and she had kind of become a fairly accomplished outdoorswoman herself. When they arrived at the campground, the parking lot was packed with cars, and they're like, shoot, I wish we'd called ahead a couple weeks ago and reserved a site because they're probably not even available now. But they went to the front desk and they were like, you're in luck, we have one available, but it's the one that's way over there. It was this one campsite that was kind of isolated from the rest of the campground. It was far away from the bathhouse, it was far away from where you go swimming, and it was far away from the parking lot. It was just like really inconvenient. And whenever they came camping here, it was like the one site they didn't want to use. But beggars can't be choosers. They were happy to even have a site. And so they drove all the way down this little road into this very isolated campsite, kind of in the middle of this forest. Once they got there, they began setting up their respective tents because they were not going to be staying in the same tent. They each had these very small backpacking tents, which were so small that you could either zip it up all the way and stay warmer and more protected, but you had to sleep in a ball because your legs would not fit otherwise. Or you could unzip the front of your tent, and when you lay down, you could extend your legs fully, but your legs are protruding outside of your tent. So you could only do that in warmer weather and if you were comfortable having your legs poking out into the wilderness. After they set up their tents and they get their coolers set up and they have all their stuff kind of the way they want it, they go out hiking for the rest of the day. When they come back, they're totally exhausted, they fall asleep, and nothing of note occurs over that first night. The next day they get up, they go back out, they go hiking all day all over again, and they come back that night and they are totally exhausted again. And they get into their tents and they go to bed. And this night, something of note would happen. At about 3 a.m., Katie wakes up and she hears footsteps walking towards the campsite from a little ways off. They're in the woods somewhere. And she's thinking, okay, It's got to be my father because he's diabetic and every night he gets up to go to the bathroom maybe 3-4 times, and he probably was just walking to the bathhouse and now he's walking back. But she realizes the bathhouse is over here, not over here. So what is he doing walking towards the campsite from this side? The footsteps come out of the tree line, they come into the clearing that is their campsite, and they stop about 2-3 meters outside of Katie's tent. Now there were no windows on Katie's backpack tent, there was just little vents at the front and the back that kind of pointed down, and so she couldn't see out anyways, and there was no illumination out, so you can't even pick up a silhouette. It's just total darkness out there, she can't see who's out there, she can only hear them. But she's thinking, okay, maybe my dad got lost coming back from the bathhouse because he didn't have a flashlight and he walked too far. That's possible. Or, he could have decided to relieve himself just in the tree line, even though he's not known to do that. He's a guy that goes to the bathhouse. And so she's running through these scenarios that are convincing her that, oh, that's just my dad. But what she really wants to hear is that person walk away from her tent and get into her father's tent, because that will confirm in her mind that that was her father. And so she's sitting here waiting for that confirmation, and she hears the footsteps again, but instead of walking around her tent to her father's tent, this person walks right up against her tent very quickly. And they clearly begin leaning over her little tiny tent because she can hear them breathing right above her. And this is when she realizes, that's not my dad. And as she's having this terrible revelation that some stranger is outside her tent right now, she has an even worse revelation. It was a warm night that night, so she was sleeping with her tent unzipped and her legs poking out the end. She musters the courage to begin slowly retracting her legs back inside of her tent. But before she's able to do that, this person stands up, turns, and starts walking towards the base of her tent where her legs are. She's completely frozen and terrified about what's about to happen. But this person doesn't stop at her feet. They keep moving and in fact start circling her tent. But because they were making a lot of noise and walking around her, it allowed her to pull her legs back into her tent without, this person hearing her. And so she had the illusion of safety being inside of her tent, but her tent is still unzipped. So she's waiting for this person to come around and crouch down and look inside of her tent because it's open. And so she's just looking down there hoping that doesn't happen. But unfortunately, right at this moment, the person walked to the base of her tent and came to a stop, right outside where the opening to the tent is. And so she's sitting there thinking, please don't come in here, please don't come in here, please don't come in here. And even though her feet are pulled up into her tent, she suddenly feels something pinch her foot, and she knows it's a hand. Something has grabbed my foot. And she stifles a scream and she starts shaking uncontrollably because her instincts are telling her, don't let this person know you're awake. And luckily, as she's sitting there shaking from fear and trying to be quiet as best as she can, she's holding her mouth. This person stands back up again and goes back to the spot next to her tent and leans over the tent once again, and she can hear them breathing right over her. And so for several minutes, she lay there shaking with this random person who pinched her foot a minute ago, hovering over her tent in the middle of the night. And she has nothing she can do. And she's just quiet. She's hoping it's going to end soon. And eventually this person would turn around and walk over to their cooler and their table and some other things that were out. And she hears some rummaging going on. Some things are being moved around. And then this person just kind of walks off into the distance. But she doesn't know if they're gone. She doesn't know if they're standing in the edge of the tree line waiting for her to come outside. Maybe they laid a trap for her. And so she just lays there, silent, doesn't move, and she's praying to herself, please don't let anything happen to me or my father. And all night she's just laying there. And then eventually she does fall asleep. Probably hours go by, but she does fall asleep because she wakes up again when she hears her father unzipping his tent, and she charges out to meet him. And she can tell right away that he's scared. And before she can even say or begin to describe what's happened to her, he says, were you outside your tent last night at about 2-3 in the morning? Because I heard all sorts of commotion near our cooler. I wasn't sure if it was an animal. I wasn't sure if it was you. And she starts telling him, no, this is what happened to me. And as she's describing what happened to her, he looks behind her at the picnic table, which was next to their cooler, and they had their backpacks on it. Basically anything that didn't fit in their tents, they kept near this picnic table. And he points at it. And she turns around, and any item that was in the cooler or in their backpacks or that was just out has been stacked in a pyramid formation on this table. Clearly, the guy who was here last night did this for some reason they don't understand. And as they go over to look at it to see if anything's been taken, they notice this track of footprints, like these heavy footprints that have been going around and around Katie's tent. So she clearly wasn't imagining it. And so that instant, they packed everything up, got in their car, and they left. And to this day, they can barely talk about it with each other because it's all the things that could have happened. The father felt horribly guilty because he clearly heard this person, but didn't leave his tent. And his daughter was clearly in danger. And his daughter's thinking, the tent was open. This person was crouched down, reaching into my tent, grabbing my feet. Like, that's such a horrifying image. And so this has been completely traumatizing for them, and they just don't talk about it anymore. From the 1950s until present, a Canadian family has owned this very isolated cabin in the middle of the Ontario backcountry. It was the only property on this very small lake. There was two others across the lake, but they were pretty far away. And with the exception of the side of the cabin that was facing the water, the rest of it was surrounded by really dense forest that went on for quite a while. About 2 miles away from this cabin, on the other side of this dirt road, was this huge wildlife reserve that was pretty much just a huge forest that was protected. And anytime the family was visiting this cabin, the kids would at some point go into the reserve and go explore. In 2001, when the family was at the cabin, the kids were across the road over at the reserve, and they decided to walk down this particular trail that they hadn't seen before, and they just started walking. And for about 30 minutes, they're seeing new areas they hadn't seen before, and then they come to this clearing, and there's all these abandoned houses. At first, there was a little debate about whether these were actually abandoned because they did look like they were in pretty good condition, but when they walked a little bit closer, it became very clear that nature is reclaiming this land. Grass is up to your waist, there's vines growing up the side of the houses, there were cars still parked in driveways that were totally rusted out, and grass is growing all through them, and so they knew these were abandoned. They walked up to the first house they saw, and they looked in, and they couldn't believe what they were looking at. It was like whoever lived here had left without taking anything. The house was still totally furnished. In fact, their dining room table still had plates and cups and forks and knives, like they had just had dinner and then just got up and left. They start talking about going into these houses and looking around inside, but they started wondering, like, is this a museum? Is that why everything is in such good repair? Should we not go inside these houses? And they start looking around for any indication that definitely this is not a museum, these are just plain abandoned. And across the street from the house they were at was this totally decrepit looking house. Let's go over there and look in there. And so they look in a window, and very clearly the ceiling is totally sagging down. And the first floor is buckling completely, and there's clothes and shoes scattered everywhere. And so for them, this was confirmation that this is no museum, these are abandoned, we can totally go look around inside. And so for the next couple of hours, the kids explored all the houses that looked structurally sound, that weren't going to collapse on them. And it was just fascinating. There was all this stuff that was left behind that was fairly valuable. And they didn't take anything. They just thought it was very cool. And after a while, they decided they had seen enough, and they turned around and headed back to their cabin. After they got back, they told their parents about what they found. And their father was like, man, that sounds awesome. I want to go check that out. And so that day, they went right back over to the abandoned houses. The first house they showed him was the really decrepit looking one where the ceiling was sagging and there was women's shoes and clothes all over the ground, to show him for sure these are abandoned, because we had some doubts at first too. These are definitely abandoned. So they look at that house, and then they went back to the very first house they saw when they walked into this complex, the one that was in great condition and had the dining table still set. So they go inside and they go upstairs and they find this bedroom that, like everything else in the house, is totally intact. You got pictures on the wall, it's fully furnished. There's even still sheets made on the bed. In the pillow, it's got a head imprint from whoever was there last. And at the foot of the bed is this beautiful fur coat. And the father walks over to it and he looks at it and he's like, this is real fur. This is a really expensive coat. I want to take this for our family. But before he took it, he had a hesitation. is this really abandoned? You know, if someone had been here, they would have seen footprints all over the house just because there's grime all over the ground, and they can clearly see their footprints from where they've just come in. And he's like, no, this is just a weird situation. It's definitely abandoned, and finders keepers. And so he picks up the jacket and he says, I'm going to give this to mom after I clean it up. And so with the jacket in hand, the father and the kids explore the rest of the house. And when they go outside, they realize it's starting to get late and it's probably time to head back. And so they turn around and they start walking away from these houses towards their cabin. And they get about 50 or 60 meters away when one of the kids said he just had this weird sense that they were being watched. And so he turns around and he's shocked when he sees there is an old woman standing in the bedroom that they had just been in, where the fur coat was. She's got a loose bun on the top of her head. She's got this blue shawl on her shoulders over a cream blouse, and she's glaring at them. When the kid saw this woman, he made an audible gasp, and the rest of the group turned around too and saw this woman in the window. And the feeling was guilt. They're like, oh my goodness, we just stole from this poor woman who lives in this abandoned house. And so right away, the whole group starts walking right back towards the house. They're going to give this jacket back. In fact, the dad is like, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have taken this. I'm sorry. And as they're walking back towards the property, the woman in the window who hasn't said anything just turns around and walks back into the main part of the house. They can't see her anymore. And so as they're walking closer to the house, they're assuming she's going to come downstairs to retrieve this jacket that they've taken from her. And so they get right up to the front door, and the father is yelling to her, I'm sorry, where do you want me to leave this jacket? I can bring it in to you. And they're kind of just waiting for her to come downstairs. And she doesn't. She's nowhere to be found. She's not making any sound. She's not indicating what to do. And so after waiting for a couple of minutes, the kids don't really know what to do, and they're kind of getting uneasy about the situation. And the father is still very confident that he just wants to give this back and make amends, make peace with her, say he's sorry. And so he walks inside. He tells his kids, stay here. I'm going to go give it to her. And he goes inside and he disappears upstairs. And then all of a sudden, from across the street in that decrepit house with the caved in ceiling, they hear one of the second floor windows come slamming down. And at the same time, their dad comes charging down the stairs, no jacket with him. And he's saying, go, go, go. And the kids are spooked from the window getting slammed, and they start running away until they're about 100 meters away from these houses. And they stop and they're panting and they're out of breath. And the kids ask their dad, what happened? And he says to them, I looked everywhere upstairs and I could not find that lady. I don't know where she is. Either she's hiding from us or something, but I happened to be looking out at that other house. Something caught my eye. There was movement, and I saw another person in the second floor of that building that's falling apart. And I watched them slam the window, and then as soon as I did, I heard someone yell, get out. And I ran out after you guys. Now the kids and the dad are absolutely terrified and they want to leave, but they also want one more look at these buildings before they do. And when they had run away, they had stopped behind this big group of trees that obscured their view to the buildings. They were out of sight. And so they begin to peek their heads around the tree until they can see the building, and they can't believe what they see. Standing in the window of the fur coat room is not only the old woman, but also a very tall man who's holding her shoulders and is bending down because his head is too high to look standing. He's crouched down and he's looking out the window next to her, and they're both glaring towards them. The father and his kids are practically falling over themselves to sprint away and back to their cabin. To this day, that family has no idea who those people were, what they were doing there, how they were able to move around without making any noise and consistently hide from them and not leave any footprints. It was all very strange and terrifying stuff. And then the government ended up demolishing those houses almost immediately after they were there. And so they'll never get any answers because everything's gone. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of